Hello and welcome to The Edge, where we'll take an in-depth analysis of today's top stories by looking beyond the edge. We'll bring you not just the facts, but also deep insights into the topics with expert opinions and social media reactions. To make a start with our look beyond the edge. Thousands of Palestinians have returned home to scenes of devastation, with officials saying that reconstruction might take years. Will Palestinians get the necessary support from the international community? Western countries have condemned Belarus for diverting a plane flying over its territory to arrest an opposition journalist. What are the natures of the charges against the young journalist? And what information do we have right now on his current detention? And a recent study in the United Kingdom gives new hope regarding the fight against COVID-19 variants, saying that 2 shots of the Pfizer and AstraZeneca coronavirus vaccines are highly effective against the Indian variant. Can this study increase the trust in coronavirus vaccines after several recent health concerns? And those are the 3 topics that we'll be taking a look at today from Beyond the Edge. Let's get started. We've seen UN agencies on the ground in Gaza following the latest round of bombardments and what seems to be a lot of momentum from international figures to make sure rebuilding efforts are shored up by political action. Our following infographic has the main facts. As international actors continue mediation efforts, Gaza has started reconstruction efforts in light of Friday's ceasefire agreements.
Palestinians in Gaza have begun picking through the rubble after days of Israeli airstrikes reduced hundreds of buildings to rubble. Palestinian officials put reconstruction costs at tens of millions of dollars in Gaza.
Thank God, after 11 days of suffering and bombing, and we've been living under violent bombing and siege for years, thank God, we have come out of this war healthy and alive. Here I have my shop that was destroyed, but we are continuing.
Palestinians in Gaza took to the streets to celebrate the truce.
The people of Gaza are known for their love of life despite whatever happens. We are in the process of restoring life as it was before. We are determined to provide quick relief and start the process of reconstruction and remove the rubble. We will start today.
The Israeli-Palestinian violence that erupted on 10th May was triggered by anger from people in Gaza over the home eviction threats for families living in East Jerusalem.
And I'm joined live from London by Dr. Anas Al-Tikriti, who's the CEO of the Cordoba Foundation. Dr. Al-Tikriti, thank you for joining us today here on The Edge. We've just been watching about the reconstruction efforts in Gaza. It's amazing that we can even talk about reconstruction after the bombardments of last week. Surely there's so much to be done in Gaza. How are things progressing since the ceasefire began?
Not very well. I mean, obviously, we're discussing Gaza and reconstruction, but you have to bear in mind that this whole carnage started with the Israeli policies in Al-Aqsa Mosque, in Sheikh Jarrah, and in elsewhere throughout the occupied territories of Palestine. So the fact that these acts of aggression continue, these violations continue, does not bear well. However, in terms of Gaza, and coming back to the issue of reconstruction, you have to bear in mind, and I'm pretty sure that all your viewers will know, that in the past 10, 12 years, Gaza has been through this on numerous occasions. 4 times particularly, when the devastation has been on a par as to what there is right now in terms of the carnage and the chaos and the rubble that fills the streets and the such. So the people of Gaza, unfortunately, they've been, in a sense, normalized to these kinds of attacks and the aftermath of those attacks. It's actually quite troubling that we talk in those terms about nigh on 2 million people who have done nothing, wrong, who've committed no crime, but the world continues to punish them and to keep them locked up in this, what is effectively the largest open-air prison in the entire world. But they've been through this before. They'll get through this again. Already there are several pledges, some from civil society organizations around the world, some from philanthropists, and some from neighboring governments that have pledged to rebuild some of Gaza's neighborhoods and to rebuild and reconstruct some of the towers that Israel targeted. But the problem is that unless the root of this problem is actually resolved, and that we actually visit the reasons why it is that Gaza, for the 4th or 5th or 6th or 8th time in the last decade, has had to suffer this level of chaos, violence, death and destruction. Unless we do that, to be perfectly honest, reconstruction is just patchwork on what is a gaping wound.
I take your point very strongly, and indeed, you raise a very interesting, very important issue, which is the world's eyes are on Gaza right now. We saw the devastation last week. We know the deaths of 66 children and dozens of innocent women as well in Gaza. And when we talk about, when we use words like reconstruction and rebuilding, it has a very nice rosy feel to it, that it's going back to something good. But if we are talking about rebuilding what was there before the bombing, then that isn't a normal that we would recognise. For those people that don't understand exactly the situation in Gaza, could you explain to us just very briefly about the electricity, about the water, about the sewerage, about the problems of bringing things into Gaza to build what you and I recognise as a normal life?
No, you're absolutely right. I think that the situation in Gaza is an anomaly to everyone else's life. Only 3 days ago, the Cordoba Foundation, my organization, we held a webinar discussing the aftermath of the recent Israeli attacks. And we had several academics, but amongst those that we invited was a young artist and teacher from Gaza. And it was quite striking to our audience that she was speaking to us with a blank screen. And the reason was because they had no electricity at the time of our session going out. And she spoke as a matter of fact that, well, you know what, we don't have electricity, so apologies for me not being able to share my video. But to everyone else, you know, it was quite striking that we were actually witnessing for ourselves just one strand of the reality of life in Gaza today. The fact is that since 2006, 2007, when the international community, and let's make absolutely sure and absolutely clear that Gaza was punished as a result of the Palestinian people taking part in a free and fair election and electing their government. Now, regardless of whether that government was Hamas by a landslide or otherwise, but it was a democratic process in which more than 85% of the Palestinians took part. It was accredited as one of the fairest and freest and most professionally held and organized elections that the international observers had witnessed. And yet the people of Gaza, the people of Palestine in all, were punished. Gaza was cut off from the entire world. And as a result, since then, and as a result of Israeli punitive, acting with impunity, basically, Gaza cannot receive any building material, no cement, no steel structures in order to construct their buildings according to what you and I recognize as mundane, normal kind of buildings and structures that can withstand the kind of bombing and shocks that come to the city every now and then. Gaza is literally something like a 30 square mile area where 2 million people live, and it's highly densely populated. It's one of the most densely populated places in the entire world, and people have to suffer not only frequent and regular power outages, but also the lack of drinking water, the lack of basic facilities. Imagine if someone was severely ill and needed special care that can only be attained outside of Gaza. They wouldn't be able to travel because the only crossing into Egypt, the Rafah crossing, is closed more than 95% of the time. So life is nothing like you and I know, nothing like most of our viewers, thankfully, recognize or know. But it's a life that, unfortunately, has been put in place under the gaze of the international community. We call for democracy, for humanity, for equal rights, for women's rights, for children's rights. Yet when it comes to Gaza, it seems that we operate according to a different set of values.
And yet, as you've intimated through that, the people of Gaza themselves have a remarkable spirit. We've spoken to many citizen journalists, I guess they'd be described as, in the past weeks. And we know from reports that we've done previously, the hopes and aspirations, the dreams of the young people, the children in Gaza. It's remarkable that that this side of Gaza isn't in itself recognized around the world as these are humans that are suffering under this pressure. What about the tremendous trauma that the barrage of rockets, the fighter jets streaming overhead every few minutes? What about, how's the trauma being dealt with in Gaza?
Again, you're absolutely right in terms of that side of Gaza, which again we afford scant attention. You know, we talk about human resilience, we talk about fortitude, we talk about hope, we talk about optimism. But to be perfectly honest, that can all be manifested better than anywhere else in Gaza. The fact that yesterday, Sunday, that everyone went back to work, schools were reopened, despite, you know, the immense destruction that the entire city and its people suffered. But everything goes back to work because that's how life is. And, you know, anyone who had a spare shovel got down on the streets and started clearing up. It's just how life is. And to be perfectly honest, and the fact that they know, as well as anyone who knows anything about Gaza and Palestine knows, that it's just a matter of time when Israeli fighter jets will bomb the city again. Yet, still, that kind of incredible resilience just marches forth. So it's something that I think is, you know, sort of the brighter side of life in Gaza, but that mustn't mask the immense catastrophe and trauma, as you put it, that people suffer. You know, we talk about how when children see a particular site that is inappropriate, how that could damage them. We talk about how we go through certain traumas that affect us throughout our entire life. But we're talking here about a 2 million nation that continues to see virtually on a daily, weekly basis levels of violence, levels of destruction, levels of carnage, levels of fear that none of us can imagine, and rightly so. No one should imagine. You know, the famous story that two brothers exchange their children, just so that if a bomb strikes, that someone from the family will remain, will survive. You know, that kind of feeling. When you're going to bed, people should feel safe. Indeed. Yet the people of Gaza have been almost desensitized to immense fear. And the trauma in children, what they see, what they witness, the death of their school children, the death of their parents, their siblings, their loved ones, is something that, it's very, very difficult to put into words and to quantify.
It's something that no one should ever have to experience. Dr. Anas Al-Takriti, unfortunately, that's all we have time for. Let's hope that the citizen journalists and continue to do their work, because it appears that it is touching people around the world, and hopefully the message will be going to get out and things will change. Thank you so much for joining me here today on The Edge. Thank you.
Thank you.
In the wake of the conflict that caused heavy Palestinian casualties, locals in the Gaza Strip woke up to dense mounds of rubble where residential homes and other buildings used to stand. Workers there say that they are faced with a lack of funds and equipment for their rubble removal work. The coming days will show if they'll get the necessary support that's been promised by parts of the international community. For now, let's move on to our next topic to discuss the latest developments in Belarus. A Belarusian activist was detained in Minsk after his Ryanair flight was forced to land by fighter jets. But who is Roman Protasevich? Our infographic has more. A Ryanair plane forced to divert to Minsk in order for Belarus to detain an opposition journalist on board has now safely arrived at the Lithuanian capital, Vilnius, its original destination.
Belarus has sparked international outrage by forcing a Ryanair plane to divert to Minsk before arresting an opposition journalist on board. Belarus grounded the Ryanair passenger plane flying over its airspace on Sunday for what turned out to be false claims of a bomb on board. Although the flight was on its way to Lithuania from Greece, Belarusian authorities ordered a military fighter jet to escort it to the capital city of Minsk. According to local media, Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko had personally deployed the warplane. No explosives were found on board the jet. Instead, when it reached the ground, authorities detained one of the passengers, Belarusian journalist Roman Protasevich. 26-year-old Protasevich worked for online news service Nexta last year when it broadcast mass protests against Lukashenko. He's now wanted on extremism charges and is accused of inciting riots, allegations he denies. A passenger on board the aircraft said Protasevich had his head in his hands and was shaking when he realized the flight was diverted to Minsk. Later, as he was led away, he reportedly remarked, "I'll get the death penalty here."
When it was announced that we're going to lengthen Minsk, so the Romans stand up to really open the, let's say, luggage door, take the luggage, and was trying to split the things, like computer, give it to a girlfriend, iPhone or whatever it's called, phone.
After 7 hours in Minsk, the flight retook its course and landed in Vilnius, Lithuania. Lithuania's president, Gitanas Nausėda, said Belarus must face consequences.
It should be noted that such attacks on the opposition have recently become systematic. I'm attending the European Council tomorrow, and we will no doubt raise this issue as well. It's time to stop communicating with the regime just by making declarations. Concrete measures are needed, capable of changing the behavior of the Belarusian regime.
Global leaders followed suit in their condemnation, including U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and head of EU's European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who tweeted, quote, "Those responsible for the Ryanair hijacking must be sanctioned." Human rights groups say about 35,000 people have been detained in Belarus since August, and more than 1,000 criminal cases have been launched.
Earlier today, political scientist Alina Kutsko evaluated Belarus' diversion of a plane travelling between EU member nations, saying that President Alexander Lukashenko cares very little about the international norms and rules.
By the standards of the current Belarusian regime, this is a totally new level of escalation and a totally new level of risk that the government is willing to take. Lukashenko is sending a very clear message. He cares very little about the international community, specifically the Western countries, and he cares very little about the international norms and rules. For him, his domestic survival is much more important currently. He knows that despite everything that is shown on the state television, he is still very vulnerable, and the only way for him to remain in power is to go after his opponents in any way he can. That's why he is very emboldened in international action. But also he has this feeling of impunity. Over the past year, he was able to get away with quite a lot. The sanctions that were imposed on him are rather not that painful for him. And this is the risk that he is willing to take because the costs for him are still significantly lower than the benefits. What can be done is definitely a much broader set of economic sanctions imposed on the state-owned companies, but also with people who are known to help Lukashenko perpetrate the crimes domestically. And it's important to do it in solidarity between the European Union, the United Kingdom, but also the United States. There are a lot of discussions whether, for example, the flights and air traffic between Belarus and the European Union should be stopped entirely. I'm not a proponent of this measure simply because it also makes it much more difficult for people, for dissidents to leave the country and potentially puts more people in danger.
So, dramatic situation with the rerouting of a plane almost at its destination with the claims of a bomb scare on board, and yet getting redirected to Minsk. And one of the passengers being arrested, that passenger being a journalist. There's been tremendous outrage from around the world with calls for sanctions against Belarus. Western countries have condemned Belarus for diverting the plane flying over its territory to arrest the opposition journalist Roman Protasevich. When he first heard about the diversion of the plane, he showed fear and said that there was a chance that he would be facing the death penalty and begged that the plane wasn't redirected. However, Belarus scrambled fighter jets to force the plane bound for Lithuania to land. Police took Roman Protasevich away when the passengers disembarked. Alongside him, there were also some agents, possibly KGB agents, that were on board, who also 5 people didn't reboard the flight that moved on. European leaders have threatened to limit international air traffic over Belarus and possibly restrict its ground transport. Several Western leaders reached for the strongest language to condemn Sunday's incident as countries called for the release of 26-year-old journalist. The coming days will show how Belarus will react. But for now, let's move on to our final topic. Now, many new cases of COVID-19 in parts of the United Kingdom are being blamed on what's known as the Indian variant. But how does it spread, and is the Indian variant more infectious? Our following infographic explains. A recent study has found that the Pfizer and AstraZeneca coronavirus vaccines are highly effective after just 2 doses against the variant first identified in India.
English health officials say that a double dose of COVID-19 vaccines is almost as effective against the fast-spreading variant of the coronavirus first identified in India as it is against Britain's dominant strain. A study by Public Health England found that the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine was 88% effective against symptomatic diseases with the B.1.617.2 variant 2 weeks after the second dose. That compared with 93% effectiveness against the B.1.1.7 Kent strain, which is Britain's dominant COVID variant. The study said that 2 doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine were 60% effective against symptomatic disease from the Indian variant compared with 66% effectiveness against the Kent variant. The study showed that a first dose of both vaccines was 33% effective against symptomatic diseases from the B.1.617.2 after 3 weeks, lower than its 50% effectiveness against the B.1.1.7. Concern about rising cases in Britain of the variant first found in India prompted Germany to say on Friday that anyone entering the country from the UK would have to quarantine for 2 weeks upon arrival.
And I'm joined from Weston-super-Mare in the United Kingdom by Professor Parag Singhal, who's a consultant endocrinologist and National Secretary of the British Association of Physicians of Indian Origin. Dr. Singhal, thank you for joining us again here today on The Edge.
Thank you.
Now, in the past, we've spoken about grave concerns over vaccines with the side effects that people have experienced. But it's good news that there's a study now that seems to be giving some very positive evidence of how effective these vaccines are. Could you explain this to us?
Yeah, I mean, I think because Indian strain, in India at least, is highly infectious, very virulent, and even young people, newborn, everybody is getting affected. So there is a real worry in India. And Indian strain has been identified in the United Kingdom as well. And the cases are rising, and the majority of new cases are attributed to Indian strain. So obviously, there was a lot of worry. But the new study actually is very welcome news. It's a hope for all of us that both Pfizer as well as AstraZeneca, 2 doses are effective against the Indian strain as well, which is really heartening news. 88% for Pfizer and in real world evidence 60% for AstraZeneca. And that's very, very reassuring. And that just emphasizes one very, very important point, that vaccine is the answer right now. Everybody will have to get vaccinated sooner or later. And UK actually is doing pretty well in terms of vaccination.
And this also says how important it is for people to follow through with their, I was going to say treatment, with their medication. Many people around the world have received, of these two-shot vaccines, have maybe received the first inoculation, but then either put off or given up with the second one. So in the two-dose regimen, it's really important for people to take the full course of treatment.
Absolutely. I think it's not one dose, because one dose is only partially effective, 33% effectiveness or safety. I think everybody will have to go for both doses, and it's sooner the better. And I think in the context in India, there are myths, there are beliefs, there are false beliefs, people thinking about whether it will change their DNA status or whether it has something which will change them. And I think all those beliefs will have to be put to rest, and we need a very strong message across the whole world about vaccinating the population across the world. And the sooner we ramp up the production of vaccines, the better it is. And yeah, but vaccine is not the only thing. With vaccine, we still need to continue with the rest of the things, which is having COVID appropriate behavior, masks, social distancing, and so on and so forth. But the good news is that the Indian variant, which has been detected in cases in the UK, so far doesn't appear to be as virulent as in India. So that's good news, but that doesn't mean that we can let our guard down. We will have to ramp up our vaccination. And just giving you one data, if you look at the vaccination tracker, take, for example, Israel. They have vaccinated everyone at least the first dose. And a lot of people obviously have received the second dose as well. And look at the number of new cases in Israel. Now, that's not just vaccine. Perhaps the population is disciplined and they are following COVID-appropriate behavior. So I think we have to have this multi-pronged approach, vaccination and rest of the behavior and precautions as needed before.
Well, the word that springs to mind there is responsibility, taking responsibility for your health and your community's health. Just come back to the study. As I've said many times in the last year, it seems we're learning an awful lot from this pandemic. And one of the things that's come up from this report that we can learn from is that the studies that are done, the medical studies that are done, are very in-depth and very important. So if we look at the data and look at the numbers, you quoted, I think it was 80% and 60% or thereabouts between the two.
Yeah.
And there are several underlying reasons as to why these figures might be different, I believe. The samples of those studied, as well as those inoculated in the first place. So these are very important things to bear in mind as well, aren't they?
That's very true, because UK started with Pfizer. So there is more data around Pfizer vaccine. Therefore, in a way, we can have a very meaningful data of 88% efficacy after 2 doses. AstraZeneca, right now, the data is there, but maybe in due course, AstraZeneca might come out with similar data. So it all depends how much vaccine has been used. So there are multiple factors. But I think just wanted to add one more study for our discussion. So there was a study in US which showed that both Moderna and Pfizer are not only effective against preventing symptomatic disease, severe disease, but also prevented from getting infected, thereby prevent the spread of infection. And that's the key thing, because vaccine now we are determining and we are learning as we go along. They're not only good for preventing severe disease, but also if they can prevent the spread of the disease, that clearly is a very good news, because that will allow us to control the virus and get on top of it.
Of course, preventing the spread of disease is paramount. in the United Kingdom, the lockdown rules seem to be constantly changing, and now I see there's great hope that even more opening up will come in the middle of June. Is this realistic? What the British government is aiming towards?
I think the British government is pretty confident about the vaccine program they are following. So there, 60 million people have been vaccinated, at least the first shot, or in a way 90% of population. Wow. And they are being very cautious in terms of opening up and easing the lockdown or easing the restrictions. And they are watching the proceedings and watching the space very carefully. And I suspect at any indication of surge or trend becoming the other way, I think they will probably have limited regional lockdowns or local lockdowns. But right now, the data is looking encouraging and the number of new cases have plateaued. So I think that is what is giving confidence to the British government.
Can I ask a technical question? We hear about the Indian variant and the British, or the Kent variant, as I think it's known. Are these and the South African variant, of course? Are these the only variants, or is that actually a simplification of the reality that there are actually many more variants, but these encapsulate the main ones? Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think it is very, very simplification of the different strains. Any strain found in India is called Indian variant. It is found in Kent is called Kent variant. And now there is a Yorkshire variant.
Really?
And then Brazilian variant. But this just shows that this virus has the ability to mutate quite fast, rapidly. And with mutations, different variants are going to happen. It doesn't matter what name we put to those variants, but it's about the mutation. And unless we control the spread of infection, mutations will continue. So the key to success is preventing spread of infection, reducing the number of new cases.
So is the fact that we're using the word variant and mutation a lot in this pandemic, the fact that it has spread so much, because they don't seem to be words that we've used for other illnesses in the past?
No, that's very true. And because rest of the viruses don't mutate so fast, don't mutate so rapidly, and their mutations actually become a little bit more friendly towards the population. And this is a very different virus, which has ability to mutate very, very fast. And that is why we are coming up with different variants every week, literally.
Wow. So it's really something for the scientists to be keeping on top of and to track it. This is just amazing how much we've undervalued the medical profession in identifying illnesses and treating them. This new focus that we have, this new understanding perhaps that we're beginning to have about the importance of research, is that going to change the way that people encourage their governments to fund research in the future?
I think that's a very important question for the simple reason, that for the last few years, especially in the United Kingdom and a few other countries, research had taken a backseat. And I think this is now going to provide a stimulus and incentive for researchers, leading researchers, to continue with their research. And probably there is no doubt in my mind that government will be much inclined to fund research, technology, and all those things, and rather than ignoring it, which was happening for the last few years. So that's, again, a very good news for researchers.
Indeed. Now, hopefully the pandemic will finish sooner rather than later. But of course, that comes down to the world being vaccinated. The World Health Organization has given out several warnings about the fact that some of the richer countries, for example, the United Kingdom, but particularly the United States, are spending a lot of time focusing on their own needs. And in the United States, the World Health Organization has been critical of its inoculations of young people when other countries around the world still are barely off the starting blocks. So what needs to be done around the world? And is it down to just the COVAX program, or should there be something more to spur the world on?
I think there has to be more of a COVAX program. There's no doubt about it. But I think the rich countries need to understand that they can't insulate themselves against this virus. This is a global problem. And if they ignore the poor countries and don't vaccinate them, then that problem is going to come to them sooner or later. So I think it is in interest of everyone that everybody in the world gets vaccinated. And this is where the US proposal of law or waiver of vaccine, I think, is a very welcome news. And I think it is the duty of rich countries to do more, because there are some countries where not even a single dose has been administered so far. And that's not good for the world. So I think there is a, what you call, onus on rich countries to do more now.
Well, Professor Parag Singh, thank you so much for joining us here today on The Edge. Let's hope that the vaccinations continue to bring us good news and continue to bring an end to this pandemic. Thank you so much for joining us here today on The Edge. Thank you. Many countries already have entry bans on people from the United Kingdom and elsewhere, but we don't yet know whether others will follow suit, specifically in response to the variant from India. Coming days and months will show if the recent study can increase the hope in defeating the variant. And now, before closing our programme, let's have a look at social media to hear your voices and reactions to today's top stories shared with the hashtags Gaza. And let's see what you've been saying today about Gaza on Twitter. This wave of mass arrests will take part of what apartheid Israel calls a law and order campaign. Thousands of occupation forces will carry out violent arrests of Palestinians, people kicking into doors, terrorised families and kidnapping men and women. Amar Grayab says, up waiting for the electricity. All batteries are nearly dead due to lack of fuel and damaged power lines. We only get 4 hours of electricity per day, and sometimes less. Free Palestine. And Abir Kopti says, don't reduce Gaza to a humanitarian issue. It's also political and requires political action that addresses the root cause of the problem, and that is ending the Israeli blockade, aggression and military occupation. And let's now take a look at our video of the day, which tells the story of Shabam Aslim after Israeli airstrikes destroyed his family's bookstore in Gaza.
بديت في المكتبة من شهر 8 2016. بديت بمبلغ بسيط، بجزء بسيط من المعدات والكتب. شوية شوية حاولت إني أكبرها لحد ما وصلت إنها مكتبة متكاملة فيها كل المعدات وفيها عدد لا بأس به من الكتب. تختص في الكتب الثقافية وكتب العلمية والخدمات الطلابية كطباعة وتصوير وأبحاث وتوفير جميع الكتب المطلوبة للطلاب. استفيد منها طبعا اللي هو عائلتي وعائلة إخواني بيشتغلوا معايا. ما أقول إيش عشان أفتح المحل. الحمد لله. هم تواصلوا معي على الواتساب وبلغوني إنه في حملة تبرعات راح تنشأ باسمك، وهم شغالين عليها يعني. وبس هو المشكلة إنه كيف حيصل المبلغ لقطاع غزة بسبب الحصار. إن شاء الله إذا صار وصل المبلغ عندي بمساعدة اللي بيقدر يساعدني إنه يصل إلى المبلغ، ممكن إنه أنا أبني مكتبة جديدة بكل طاقتها إن شاء الله، وراح تكون أفضل وأحسن من أول. وطبعا بجهود المساهمين والمحبوبين والناس كتير اللي تواصلت معايا وحبت تدعمني وحبت كتير تشارك في حملة التبرعات. إن شاء الله يا رب اتصلوا بكون يعني ثمرة مجهودهم جميعا إن شاء الله رب العالمين.
And that's all for this episode of The Edge with me, Andy Boyns. Stay tuned as we'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth analysis on the top stories and a look beyond the edge.